The energy needs the energy needs of these data centers are said to be massive. And as you've no doubt heard, there's a massive ongoing build out of data centers across the country. 1,500 new data centers that are in development in the US right now. Whether we actually want these data centers, whether they'll actually be built, whether this projected energy demand actually comes to pass, rhetorically, the message right now is we need a lot of power. And so there's now this mania for building new nuclear reactors. Just to give a real brief slice of what that looks like for those not already clued in clean energy standards across the country, nuclear energy is being recategorized as clean. Some states that have moratoria on nuclear energy are lifting those bans to allow new reactor construction. You have the Department of Energy pushing to achieve criticality with three so-called advanced reactors by July 4. Earlier this year, the Department of Energy flew a microreactor across state lines in a helicopter, just to give you some of the sense of the vibe in the nuclear energy space these days. One last thing I'll just mention there is the US government is giving away plutonium pits to reactor startups like Oklo to reprocess and use as nuclear fuel. Plutonium pits, of course, being of high weapons proliferation concern. So we've got a unprecedented booster-ish, feverish build out or proposed build out of nuclear energy. By the way, one thing I would mention on there, we have a fresh understanding here from the Harvard School of Public Health that potential radiation risks from nuclear reactors are not just theoretical. In the event of a meltdown or accident, the routine releases even are now known through Harvard's study to be associated, proximity to nuclear reactors is associated with increased cancer mortality. So just weaving in the radiation piece here. Again, big picture, we've got a buildup of the nuclear arsenal. We're perhaps facing the highest threat of nuclear weapons exchange since the Cold War. Very heightened geopolitical tensions, which has our country and others conducting a massive, something like $2 trillion are being spent right now to refresh our nuclear weapons arsenal at the same time that key non-proliferation treaties like New START are expiring. And meanwhile, there's insufficient understanding or sometimes outright denial of the links between the nuclear weapons industry and the nuclear energy industry, which basically boils down to those two industries share a technical workforce. They share much of the industrial infrastructure. You have an expansion of nuclear energy. It's very much risking an expansion of nuclear weapons risks. And that nuclear weapons industry already has a large toxic legacy across the country. Department of Energy sites with very deep contamination, much of it radiological, much of it not receiving anything like a sufficient cleanup. I see we have Melissa Bumstead here on the line, who I've done some work with at the Santa Susana Field Lab site in Southern California, but many others here as well, I'm sure, for which, again, radiation protection standards are key. If those standards are weakened, those cleanups are going to get a lot harder, to say the least. And the last kind of big picture theme that I just want to throw out there that I'm really seeing is this intergenerational knowledge gap, where so many of the heroes of our movement, the heroes of nuclear accountability, the watchdogs tracking this, many of whom are on this call, but many of whom are not on this call because they are retiring, they are passing away in some cases. I mentioned my former boss, Dan Hirsch. And so you've got a younger generation. I'm 32. Folks my age, if they hear about nuclear issues at all, it's probably just to hear, well, isn't it, a climate solution? So we've got some real headwinds here when we're talking about nuclear safety issues, of which effective radioactive regulations are key. Really a perfect storm for an unprecedented level of nuclear dangers. So that's all a very short gloss over, issues we could spend many hours talking about. But I wanted to paint that picture a little bit because when we're talking about radiation protection standards, um, those standards set by the federal government touch on every one of these issues and more, and have systemic effects. Um, so just to lay out the details, which again, many of you will probably be familiar with, last year, May of 2025, Executive Order 14300 from President Trump. This was one of a series of executive orders aimed at boosting and deregulating the nuclear industry. Um, Among other things, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been ordered to revise 100% of its regulations. The NRC is undergoing, I think, safe to say, the most severe deregulation in its history. One of those key regulations is what we're focused on here, radiation protection standards. Um, that executive order directs the NRC to reconsider its reliance on the linear no threshold model. Well, what's the linear no threshold model? Um, it's the long-standing scientifically accepted model of health impacts from low-dose radiation. It's a fancy sounding name, but it's really kind of all in the name right there. Linear risks from and harms from radiation are understood to be linear with dose. The higher dose you have, the higher health impacts you have. And no threshold. There is no threshold below which radiation is harmless. And even at the smallest doses of radiation, there is some amount of risk of health harms. You can see why, from an industry perspective, it could be very advantageous to get rid of this understanding that there's no threshold, that even the smallest amounts of radiation are harmful. If the understanding shifts, as President Trump and the nuclear industry would like, and there's thought to then be a threshold, well, any radiation exposures below that threshold would be considered harmless, would be effectively deregulated. Um, Linear no threshold has been reaffirmed by essentially every major scientific body that's looked at it, including the Radiological Science Organization out of the United Nations, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and the NRC itself. 2015, there was a petition for rulemaking to the NRC that similarly asked the NRC to do away with the linear no threshold model and to raise the public radiation standards to 10 rem, which would have been a 100 times higher level of allowable radiation exposure for the public. The NRC correctly rejected that petition in 2021, reaffirming linear no threshold as the fundamental model that underpins our understanding of low-dose radiation, and reaffirming the existing radiation standards. Yet now, just a few years later, the NRC is reopening this question under orders from the president. Part of our work in defending radiation protection standards, which do need defending, we're expecting the NRC's proposal to propose new rulemaking to come out early next month on July 2, and we'll have to see what that actually proposes, but we're expecting anywhere from a 5 to 100 times weakening of radiation protection standards, 5 to 100 times higher levels of radiation that you, me, and everyone would be allowed to be exposed to. We want to defend against that, but not only that, we really should be seeing radiation protection standards strengthened, not weakened. The current worker limits are 2/3 of a century old. The current radiation limits for the public are 35 years old, 36 actually now, I think. Radiation science has advanced a lot in that time, and as our understanding advances, so we understand that radiation is riskier than was previously thought. As just one example of many on that, and others here on the call are going to, I think, talk about some of the other ways that the existing radiation standards fail to protect, especially vulnerable populations like children and women. But the NRC specifically declined in setting the current radiation standards, looked at the National Academy's really central BEIR studies, BEIR, which are foundational to setting radiation protection standards. At that time in 1991, the National Academy study showed higher risks than were previously understood from low dose radiation, and the NRC acknowledged this and declined to update and tighten the radiation protection standards at that time. So even based on 35-year-old science, our current limits are already non-protective. Um, to say nothing of the great weakening and loosening of radiation protection standards that are now expected. Um, so just to close, I think I'm coming up on the end of my time here, but 2 minutes. Thanks, Amanda. Um, as I mentioned earlier, radiation standards have systemic effects. For nuclear watchdogs, of whom there are many of us on this call, there's no shortage of deeply troubling nuclear deregulations and nuclear developments, to say nothing of the deeply troubling world situation. There's a lot to focus on. Why are we focused on radiation standards in particular? Because they have a systemic effect. They show up in many different places. If radiation standards are weakened in the way we now expect the NRC to do, cleanup at toxic sites across the country, cleanup of radiation will slow greatly, if not stop outright, with high levels of radiological contamination being declared not to be a problem. The nuclear reactors that are being widely proposed and developed would have greatly weakened regulations, including essential regulations like uh, exclusion zones and the need for containment and general protection from radioactivity. Um, there would likely be less discretion in medical applications of radioactivity. One that I like to mention is the consumer goods supply. Just to tell a brief anecdote, I mentioned the Santa Susana Field Lab earlier in Southern California, where some years ago the Boeing company demolished radioactive buildings as part of its cleanup and improperly sent those radioactive buildings to a metal recycling facility to be recycled into the consumer goods supply, resulting in radioactive eyeglasses, zippers, belt buckles. Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that we could expect to see a lot more of, with no effective regulation essentially allowing your belt buckles, zippers, eyeglasses to contain high levels of radioactivity. Obviously, that's not the only or most concerning weakening of radiation standards, but I think it really comes home. It's hard to be closer than the glasses on your face. Um, oh, and I guess I should say a word. I know I'm out of time here, but our coalition is stepping up to do what we can to defend against this NRC rulemaking. We'd like to stop the NRC from weakening radiation protection standards. Um, and beyond that, we need to, like I say, this knowledge gap, this lack of understanding across society of the harms of radiation, including at the low doses. So we are launching a targeted focus on the NRC rulemaking, which will take place over the course of this year, and then a broader multi-year educational campaign to bring these issues to broader awareness across society. Many of the groups involved in this coalition are on this call today. Um, we've been doing a lot of work to set this up. We'll be happy to tell you more about that, and happy to invite your collaboration. We need your help. It's good work, and it's maybe difficult work, but with people like these, I will say it is fun in a certain sense as well. So um, I think that's about all I have to say. Thanks again so much for being here today.
Good. Thank you so much, Hoken. And welcome to all of those of you who have been trickling in during the first speaker presentation. I'm really excited to say that we have 95 people here, which is excellent. Thanks everyone for being here today. And we're running right on time. So Mary, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Amanda, cut right in if I'm at the 10-minute mark. Don't do it with your fingers. I don't see them. Thanks. So I'm Mary Olson. I am the founder and CEO of Generational Radiation Impact Project. When I'm done talking, I'll put the website link in the chat. I want to emphasize the chat is open. We encourage comments as well as questions. It's lively over there right now. Nonetheless, focus in now on the fact that our government wants to and is moving ahead on weakening national radioactive exposure standards for the public, for workers. And this will allow every single one of their licensees, whether sites or activities, mostly industrial, we're worried about, but it's medical offices, it's all kinds of industrial activities, like those guys who come around with the sources to measure where the wires are. I mean, there's a lot of licensees that we don't even think about. And all of them will be allowed to increase the amount of radioactive emissions that come off of their activities and their sites. More radioactive pollution means more radioactive elements in our air, our food, our water, impacting human health and environmental health. And I'm going to leave the health stuff to the following speakers, but suffice it to say, I'm here to tell you that that is unacceptable. Those standards we have today are also already not protective. They are already crappy standards. So we need to show up and we need to tell them not to weaken them. We need to tell them to strengthen our radiation protection. So I'm here to say that, but I'm also here to tell you how we win. And this is because they're trying to repeat something that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission rolled out almost exactly 40 years ago. And hearing that we won 40 years ago is a source of hope, and hope can change fate. That's a line from a movie, but it's also true. And I have to tell you that the younger leaders who are coming into this coalition are also a source of hope, not only for me, but for everyone. So as much as possible, help to sort of spread that word. It's not only grandparents who are involved in this coalition. So 40 years ago, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission announced a similar idea. Deregulation of about a third of the so-called low-level radioactive waste was on the table and in the Federal Register. And they would do it about like our executive order by declaring all previous regulation unnecessary, that this waste would be below regulatory concern and therefore considered to not be radioactive at all. It would simply be dumped in regular municipal landfills. It would be recycled, as Håkan was talking about, into consumer products and into reuse of things that would formerly be considered controlled radioactive waste. Well, the industry was facing some of its first decommissioning. They wanted to save money on their radioactive waste disposal. And so their buddies over at the NRC was solving that problem for them. We'll just get rid of about a third of it by sending it out the door. So the thing is, a bunch of people got together and they flooded the comments of the BRC rulemaking. We got in hundreds of comments the last time they tried this in 2015. This time we need to aim for thousands of comments. They don't have to be long. They don't have to be knowledgeable. They don't have to be expert. The experts will take care of the expert comments. But we need people to show up. And that's why we started on this earlier this year. And now we're finally raising the flag because the NRC postponed this whole process several times. So I have 5 easy steps. And some of this is not all decided by the coalition, but it's the template of what worked in 1990, 91, and 92. So here goes. We fill the docket. Yay. Then we support legal action. And your job is going to be to do some fundraising for that. We need money to pay lawyers to be able to go into federal court. You can't do that pro se. So watch for that. It's going to come up in the fall, and the litigation will be on the final rule, which means the beginning of 2027. Now, I think we can make some headway there, but only if we start bringing this issue up in every place we can, in town halls, in debates, on social media, on call-in shows. You got it, you do it. It's everybody gets mobilized around Stop Radioactive Pollution. protect better. Those are our words as a coalition. If you want different words, that's fine. But the meaning is we expect and demand better protection. So in the next 6 to 8 months, our coalition will decide, how we want to manifest that. I'm sticking up for a 50-state strategy. I like Protect Better. I like Stop Radioactive Pollution. But if a better campaign comes along, I bet you we'll support it, because this isn't about winning against each other. This is about winning against the really bad idea that more radiation is allowed into our environment forevermore, not only for this generation today, not only for this generation next year, but forevermore. You can't get it back. So we have to stop it. So if somebody comes up with a better campaign, believe you me, I'll be right there to join it. But we'll be working on that as a coalition to figure out a plan. And a 50-state strategy is needed because where we won on below regulatory concern back in 1992 under Bush as the president, it was a Democratic-controlled Congress, but it was a pro-nuclear Democrat-controlled Congress, like I'm here to tell you. We won in Congress because we got things going at the state level. You have to have states in motion, either in legislation or litigation or both, to be able to get into Congress. And Congress actually came to us because we had a federal lawsuit pending. We had campaigns, Stop Below Regulatory Concern. This is what brought me into this fight 40 years ago. We had states passing laws saying that if the waste was deregulated, the state would continue to regulate it. We were making a mess for them. That's what we have to do again. We have to figure out what's going to make the mess. And then you can get into Congress. And I really have to say, as I have not yet said publicly, congratulations to all of the survivors of nuclear weapons atmospheric testing, the downwinders. They had a generational fight with an enormous win. I know it was a partial win, but it was still an enormous partial win in the current Congress. In the big, beautiful bill, they got the Radiation Effects Compensation Act not only extended, but expanded. More people are receiving the paltry benefits, I have to say, but at least there's some benefits and some recognition for the people who suffered the radioactive pollution. Fallout has not been called that before, but I'll call it that. It's part of the radioactive pollution. It's still out there. That's the release that happened during the 50s and 60s that wasn't stopped until 1963 when they put testing below ground. Now we have to stop this new huge expansion of radioactive emissions that will happen if these weakened standards are allowed to go through and be implemented, especially because they're now expanding the number of sites that would have that opportunity to make more people sick because they're going to divide up the size of the sites and spread them out. Well, that's going to increase the populations that are impacted by radiation exposure. So this is not a little matter. This is a huge matter, and it's ours. And I am just so thrilled that the Coalition to Stop Radioactive Pollution has come together. I truly believe that the message protect better is really important. For years, my teachers told me to ask for what we want. We want better protection. So coupled with Stop Radioactive Pollution, that's the weakening of the standards, I think it has purchase. Come up with a better one, we'll be there. This is not about winning amongst ourselves. This is about winning together against a nuclear industry that is going off the charts with these young-ish, they've been aging, digital people who have no biology and no concern or commitment to our health. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to health experts.
Thank you, Mary. That was perfect timing. So we're running right on schedule. I am really happy to welcome Dr. Elizabeth McClure for the next presentation.
Thank you. I did prepare some slides, but it looks like screen sharing isn't turned on, so I can just share those later.
No, I'm going to turn it on.
Oh,
It's
okay.
okay. It's all right.
Okay.
Um,
And Libby, if you'll take a second just to introduce yourself
Yes.
as you would like to.
Yes. Thank you. So, thank you, Mary and Amanda, for the invite to this and for convening us. I'm Libby McClure. I'm an assistant professor in the epidemiology department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'm also a Kendall Fellow with the Union of Concerned Scientists Global Security Program. And my work has focused on environmental justice, inspired community engaged research. I have been fortunate enough to be mentored by Dr. Steve Wing, Dr. David Richardson, and giants in the organizing of nuclear and other industrial pollution frontline communities. And so I am going to just give some basics on the epidemiology evidence base behind the NRC standards. Can you see my slides? Yes. Okay, great. So apologies if this is extremely low level for some of you, but want to just give us a good foundation. So an epidemiology study is a research study that typically aims to measure the relationship between a specific exposure and a health outcome. So here we're talking about the epidemiology evidence base on the relationship between radiation exposure and various health outcomes. Cancer has been largely the focus of the regulatory standards, but it's known to be associated with other disease outcomes, heart disease, mortality. And I mentioned I prepared these slides so that you all can have a reference, and I'm happy to share them out afterwards as well. I wanted to make a brief note about some of the commonly used terminology within the science and the technical policy documentation as well. So we tend to talk about stochasticity and statistical uncertainty from a sampling perspective statistically. So the way we estimate confidence intervals is based on experimental design and samples. And so there's been a lot of speculation within the scientific discipline on how relevant this is when you have a full census of people, like the entire roster of nuclear workers, for example. And so the statistical imprecision and effect estimates shouldn't have any impact on the way the gravity of the reality of deaths and illnesses that we're counting and documenting in these studies. And I want to note that our evidence base is mostly based in occupational exposures, but the exposure estimates among workers provide the foundation for our understanding of environmental exposures within communities. So this is for logistical and exposure level reasons. So workers are likely to experience higher doses or exposure levels than the general public. And their individual doses tend to be more precisely measured because typically workers are required to wear personal dosimeters while working, and we can have the full roster and population easier to study. I have a little asterisk there because that's only sometimes the case. There is at the Savannah River site a study of occupational segregation and its impact on disparities in radiation exposure, as well as documentation of that radiation exposure, which informs protective measures for workers. So at the Savannah River site, female workers were less likely than males to be monitored for their radiation exposure dose, and Black workers were more likely than non-Black workers to have a detectable exposure dose. And I want to build on what Mary was saying about, it's just sort of a strange time to have been critical of our regulatory standards when we have to now come and defend the already insufficient um, standards in place. And I feel that I have to, when I start talking about the epidemiology evidence base, acknowledge the many limitations of it, because I think we can't effectively use the tools at our disposal without fully understanding their limitations. And so I want to, before I talk about sort of the bottom line of what the epidemiology has told us to inform these standards, say that the methods apply this experimental framework to assess the relationship between one specific exposure and one specific outcome. And this is really reductive, right? So it ignores the historical, social, and political processes that influence who is most likely to be exposed. And so it also forces us to shoehorn our questions like, did radiation exposure cause cancer, into an experimental framework that can often set up the individual study to fail at detecting a statistically significant association, because there are many social processes at play, making it difficult to find an appropriate control or comparison group. And exposure measurement is really difficult. And so, we know from years of doing this research that there's a long history of polluters and industries leveraging these limitations to undermine community organizing and say, look, we didn't actually cause any harm here. Also, the same exposures may be experienced in many different nuclear frontline communities, but not every impacted community gets a health study. They're really expensive and resource intensive. And so that's one piece that's, contributing to holes in the evidence base. And then even when a health study is conducted, it's difficult to establish a causal relationship between an exposure and an outcome because of ability to measure exposure, because of latency periods. So that's the time between your exposure and development of disease diagnosis and symptoms. We know that those can last up to 30 years or longer with certain types of cancers. There are also interacting environmental exposures and lack of transparency around the types and quantities of radioactive substances released into the environment. And so this is particularly salient. In my work, I work with downwinders of the Hanford nuclear facility, and the major epidemiologic study in that community basically concluded that there was no impact, no harm from living downwind and downriver of the facility. And it's because of these many limitations. So some communities have observed high rates of cancer without exposure dose reconstruction. Some document lived experiences of unexplained health issues. And I just want to say that we should elevate these forms of documentation, particularly with parallel exposure experiences, as valid evidence supporting health impacts that should be considered in the full body of evidence alongside the formal epidemiology studies. And then finally, there are political reasons why scientific studies aren't published about specific sites and sources of exposure. And I just pulled one quote from a public health assessment of the Nuclear Fuel Services Incorporated in Irwin, Tennessee. And so they say, they're not actually allowed to make public health assessment claims regarding radioactive materials. The public health assessment is solely focused on the volatile organic compounds because of the regulatory structure. So within an epidemiology study, we think about radiation exposure and it's measured in various different ways. I have links to some explainers that my colleague, Dr. Chinese Forte, wrote that are extremely useful. And so basically, it's measured in different ways depending on what kind of information is relevant. The release of radiation into the environment from a radioactive substance is measured using a becquerel, which is the decay of 1 atom per second, or a curie, the approximate number of atoms that decay per second in a gram of radium. The important quantity of absorbed radiation into the human body is energy per mass, which is measured in units of gray, the energy in joules absorbed per kilogram of tissue of the organ, or rad. And so 1 gray is 100 rads. And because the type of radiation affects absorption, as well as the sensitivity of the specific organ absorbing that radiation, another unit is called the effective dose, and that adjusts for those considerations. The effective dose is what we use to set the protective radiation exposure limits, and it's often measured in sieverts or rem. And these values are based on population statistics from the epidemiology evidence base. So we know from the evidence base that chronic health disorders are associated with exposure to radioactive materials that can affect basically any organ within the body, but including the heart, lungs, thyroid, brain, and immune system. And it can also affect human health through genetic alterations that result in cancer, organ dysfunction, and immune and metabolic disorders. The sort of accumulated evidence base supports these specific outcomes associated with these specific doses of radiation exposure. And so, the linear no threshold is based on the foundation of this epidemiologic evidence base. The LNT model is based on the epidemiology studies that show a generally linear relationship between the amount of radiation exposure and risk of developing cancer. And thank you to Cindy, who's going to go after me, who will talk about the many limitations and shortcomings of this framework. But in the basics, so linear meaning the more exposure, the greater the risk. And then no threshold, meaning that any amount of radiation exposure increases the risk of developing cancer or other health outcomes. Said another way, there's some risk even at an extremely low dose, and there's no safe amount of exposure. These are figures from the InWorks cohort study, which is a combined cohort of several thousands of nuclear workers. And on the left, we see the effect estimates for solid cancers. So, each of these points is relative rate of mortality due to solid cancer by categories of cumulative colon dose, lagged 10 years because of the time it takes to develop colon cancer. And then the bars indicate the confidence intervals. And then that solid line is demonstrating this sort of linear relationship for the change in excess relative rate of solid cancer with solid cancer mortality with dose. And then we see a really similar linear pattern with leukemia and blood cancers. And that's the figure on the right. And so, there's just really strong evidence base supporting the linear no threshold framework. But if the NRC chooses to approve a public dose for worker exposure, even if they are still giving lip service to maintaining LNT, they may say, this level of exposure is okay. This would be adoption of a different framework that contradicts linear no threshold and its underlying strong evidence base. So the bottom line being that increased exposure leads to increased cancer and other disease risk. And that's it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Libby. We're running now about 5 minutes ahead of schedule. So Cindy, I am going to turn it over to you. And I'm also going to share screen for your presentation.
Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I am Cindy Folkers. I'm from Beyond Nuclear. I am their radiation health hazard specialist. If you want more information about me, like an expanded bio, you can go ahead and click on the link that I just put in the chat. That'll give you more information about me. So I want to talk in my presentation, which is going to be fairly brief, about the shortcomings of current radiation standards and why it is necessary to point out these shortcomings in our comments while also advocating for not weakening them anymore. Next slide, please. So one above that one. Thank you. The millirem, which was talked a little bit about by Libby, is a unit that is used to represent damage to humans from exposure to radiation. NRC allows its licensees to expose an individual to at least 100 millirems of radiation per year. It could be more, but the standards actually on this point are really hard to untangle, and we're kind of still working on that. This is an exposure at the fence line. So according to this risk table that is on this slide, 1 in 286 people who receive 100 millirem per year for 70 years are projected to contract fatal cancer from that exposure. Now, this is the regulator, NRC, talking about its own regulation. The risk is actually orders of magnitude higher for the 100 millirem than EPA allows, even at Superfund sacrifice zones, just to put it in context. And I would argue that the millirem as a unit is really not verifiable because it's not a measurement. It is a calculation, which is based on a model, which in turn is based on a very specifically defined adult male. It's difficult to enforce the standard that can't really be measured. The 100 millirem limit is for each license. If a reactor site has more than one reactor unit, NRC generally, although not always, but generally it's been its practice to license each unit separately. If a nuclear site has 3 units, the limit would not be 100 millirem once, it would be 100 millirem for each unit. We don't know how they're going to handle the licensing of SMNRs either when NRC approaches that. Other agencies also have radiation exposure standards, but this particular rulemaking is about the basis for the NRC standards, so that's where we're going to be focusing. And even though this table text mentions internal doses, it is a risk calculation only. The standard governing the 100 millirem exposure is 10 CFR Part 20.1301, and it's entitled Dose Limits for Individual Members of the Public, and it mentions only external exposure calculations with regard to members of the public. Next slide, please. And there are, as Libby mentioned, a number of shortcomings in the current standards. They include environmental justice considerations. So we had an example of that. Libby mentioned in her presentation, workers of Savannah River, the workers of color were more likely to get higher exposures, and that the women workers, of which there are very few compared to the male workers in general in the nuclear industry and in the day that built these standards, they're often not monitored. And that's among workers. When you start moving into the public, you start getting even more differentiation. So you have communities that are lower income, you have communities that are rural, communities that live off the land. And if they have a nuclear facility in their midst, they are likely impacted by the predatory nature of this industry. They don't have access to the same benefits, healthcare resources, et cetera, should they become ill and need treatment. But in addition to that, there are also social and cultural differences that can make these communities more susceptible to being exposed. When you add in the disproportionate impacts for females and children who are harmed more than males from equivalent radiation exposures, you also see that you start to overlap the environmental justice considerations with the disproportionate impacts. And so a number of studies show disproportionate impacts. A number of studies hint at environmental justice issues. And many people who suffer disproportionate impacts can also, not just because they're more susceptible to radiation damage, but also because they can be more prone to getting exposed in the first place. We also have compounding and cumulative damage from exposure to radiation, which is not fully considered. All children exposed during childhood will suffer more than someone exposed in adulthood only, but not only because the child is at the life cycle that is more susceptible, but because they also have a lifetime of additional potential exposure ahead of them. And little girls are the most impacted in this scenario. So these impacts are to the individual, but I should also point out that there are studies, especially among animals, but also some studies among humans, that point to these impacts also being across generations. Pregnancy and fertility issues are unique in that this part of our life cycle is marked by rapid cell division and development of crucial organs like brain or bone or heart or blood from single cells that cannot easily recover from radiation damage, the exposure of which can be random and unpredictable. And because the human body is being formed, many radioisotopes will collect in that body that's developing during pregnancy. And the concentration of these radioisotopes can be greater in the embryo or fetal tissue than in maternal tissue. We know that this is possible for tritium. We know that it's possible for carbon-14. We also know that it's possible for strontium-90, which integrates itself into the developing bone matrix during pregnancy and can be within that individual for most of the rest of their life. Research also shows that radiation exposure can cause cardiovascular impacts and that damage inside the body from incorporated radioisotopes is also not fully accounted for, in part because it is estimated from external exposures, and this estimation from external exposures can cause an underestimation of the damage. Next slide, please. So the linear no threshold model, as has been mentioned in a couple of presentations, is targeted for reconsideration. It is the scientific basis for radiation exposure standards worldwide. And as Libby said, it rests on two principles. I will not repeat them here. Instead, I will tell you how NRC distorts them. NRC distorts the first principle by claiming that lower doses are less effective at damaging health than higher doses, despite studies, as Libby showed you, supporting the linear model. They do this by using a factor called DDREF, or dose and dose rate effectiveness factor. In addition, the NRC has ignored the second principle by allowing exposures in the first place. One of the ways that they do this is by claiming ALARA. They keep doses as low as reasonably achievable. There's a question about who gets to define what that means. So on top of these manipulation factors of LNT, NRC makes statements minimizing or dismissing how their current standards have already damaged public health and further put our health at risk, all in service of ensuring the nuclear power industry's continued existence. So I would argue that the problem isn't with the LNT model itself so much as it is with how the NRC decides to use or misuse it while they are claiming to us to be using it. So what we need is the LNT applied the way that research studies indicate we should be applying it. There is no safe dose. And on this slide, I've included two concepts that don't really fit here, but we can help. They can understanding them or knowing a little bit about them can help us frame our comments. The first one fills me personally with an incandescent rage. So I'm going to be real quick when I state it. NRC and regulators have had this trope the last couple of years, and they are using it. They say that the ability that we have to cure cancer is good because then that can basically allow them to make us sick. So rest with that for just a second. And then the second one is a really important one. Risk-benefit analysis is used to sort of balance between what the economic benefits of doing something is and what the health detriment of doing that thing is. And this is one of the principles that radiation exposure rests on, just in general and across the world, I'd say. And so what the UN Human Rights Commission on Human Health says, with regard to human health, says is that risk-benefit analysis is not in consonance with the right to health framework, as it gives precedence to collective interests over individual rights. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for us to think about when we're commenting? Well, 100 millirem per year to an individual member of the public is not protective. Protecting 1 in 286 adult males, narrowly defined, is certainly not protective enough for everyone. And right now, the NRC is allowed to kill people with how they interpret LNT and how they use it in their standards. And they will be killing more if they increase allowable radiation exposure. I want to be really clear about that because that's a very stark statement, but it really is true. There's no sugarcoating this. So what I think we should be asking NRC to do is maintain the LNT, which should be an easy lift for them because they've already kind of done it. And we are doing this to offer NRC a middle ground while we are also recognizing that the way that the NRC is misrepresenting the LNT model to form their standards is not protective enough, especially for members of the public. And I think I'm going to end it there. I look forward to having everyone ask questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Cindy. And please, everyone, join me in thanking all of our presenters today. I am going to stop